Hi there, welcome to another BKB Quantum Youth video. I'm Maria, and today I'll be giving you an introduction to a recent preprint that we put out with Luis and Juan, in which we explained our understanding and our vision of how the global high school curricula comes together in the context of our quantum revolution and quantum technologies. This video kind of came as a consequence of an invitation that we had by the University Autónoma del Estado de Morelos in Mexico, where they invited us to present this work in Spanish. And we did that and then re-recorded the presentation. And we've decided to make it again, but this time in English, so it's accessible to a bigger audience. And today I'll just be walking you through the main points of this paper, what our ideas and our findings were in a hopefully comprehensible, brief way. So the first question that we are always confronted with, and that people usually ask us, is why would you talk about teaching quantum technologies? Why would you talk about teaching quantum mechanics to high school students? You know, many high school students have not had any access to advanced physics. They may not even know that they want to do science, and these are very complex, advanced topics. And well, the first and the level of this answer, and the most simple vision of this answer, is that quantum mechanics has revolutionized our world. It's brought with it the technological era. Quantum mechanics started being developed as a science between the 1920s and 1940s, and brought with it many of the core technologies that you can find in your laptops, phones, and anything that you would really consider a new age technological device. This are things like transistors, lasers, MRIs. But it wasn't until 1980s when we started seeing the first proposals for quantum computers. So what are quantum computers? Quantum computers are devices that utilize quantum mechanics in order to compute. In 1994, Shor's algorithm, which is a factorization algorithm, was proposed, and this basically changed the game because it opened the door to what we now call quantum advantage, which is the possibility for quantum computers to solve certain problems better than classical computers can. This was followed by Grover's algorithm, which basically opened the door even wider and showed that this advantage could go well beyond just one problem. And this kind of led to an interest by companies, by academic institutions to develop quantum computers, and they actually started being a reality. We started seeing functional prototypes in the late 90s, early 2000s of quantum computers, and nowadays we live in what some call the quantum supremacy era, which basically comes down to saying we have now problems that we're solving better with quantum computers than we are with classical computers, or at least we're solving better with quantum computers collaborating with classical computers than we would have solely with classical computers. These machines are starting to, let's just say, pay off their cost, right? Now, if we talk about who has access to these machines and who has access to the knowledge necessary to utilize and continue developing these machines, there is very clearly a quantum gap that arises regarding who's able to access this knowledge. I mean, quantum computation is absent for almost any curricula from any school, high school or university level. Most high school students don't even know the field exists, and the opportunities to learn about it at that level, at that stage of education, are usually quite restricted outside of the US, Canada, or Europe. This leads to two main consequences. There is, realistically speaking, a quantum globally that is forming, where many students are left out of the possibility to engage and learn about quantum technologies, and this kind of reinforces the already existing inequalities in access to scientific and technological careers. This is, I would say, almost a symptom of it. Now, if we look at it country by country, there are quite a few things that arise. Different countries have different levels of access to different knowledge. For example, in South Africa, complex numbers don't even really appear at a curriculum level. In the United States, many students don't see linear algebra or probability theory in the curriculum. And in places like Mexico, almost no school offers any quantum-related material, right? So these are different levels at which students might not have access to knowledge that is either necessary to understand quantum mechanics and quantum technology, even if it's just at a beginner level, or even to get to the point in which they can access that material, right? And this, as I've said before, kind of leads to this topic of a quantum gap. Now, our mission as an organization is to try to make quantum accessible and inclusive for secondary school students. It's kind of the entire point of our organization and our mission. And we believe that quantum technologies are inaccessible to most students who do not have a master's degree or even a PhD. And many roles in the industry today don't really require that level of specialization. And we definitely believe that many roles in the industry tomorrow won't require that level of specialization. So that's kind of where we want to come in. We want to help host events and create videos like these that empower students to learn more about quantum technologies. So in our paper, we basically talk about this gap in knowledge and 3 levels that you might very well think are relatively reasonable because they are the 3 areas that are important for learning about quantum technologies. The first one is maths. So maths is in many ways the language of quantum computation. There are 3 pillars that we think are important in maths in order for a student to learn about quantum mechanics or to learn about any quantum technology. The first one is linear algebra, understanding things like vectors and matrices, and quantum are required to understand quantum states and operations, but in many countries these topics are like not seen or seen only in very advanced courses. Probability theory, these would be things like quantum measurements, that you need to, if you don't understand probabilities, you won't understand the concept of why you need to run multiple shots in a computation, that why there are these ideas of amplitudes. But in many countries, probabilities is already taught in an early and superficial way. And they never go into depth. Students may not see them again in the curriculum at all, or they might not have seen it in enough depth to, when they're presented with the concept of amplitude, to be able to, bridge the gap. Then there are complex numbers. So complex numbers are very important for understanding quantum interference and unitary evolution. And in most curriculums, they're not even taught. This leads to 2 dragons. The first is the fact that in many countries around the world, content in mathematics that is related to quantum mechanics is treated as abstract, and it isn't presented as if it had any real connection to applications. And this leads to the second dragon, which is loss of motivation by the students. Students don't see what a vector or matrix is for. They're not interested because they don't see the utility of it. And, quantum technologies kind of present that utility very clearly. The second main thing that we talked about in our paper was physics. So obviously, physics is the setting and the rules for the game of quantum technologies. It's incredibly important. But the foundations of quantum mechanics are rarely taught, and when they appear, it tends to be anecdotal. A physics teacher telling a story or giving a very incomplete explanation or maybe a wrong explanation. Material sciences are also quite important, especially if you're trying to learn how qubits are made. It usually has very little curriculum presence. And then there's thermodynamics, which is necessary to understand why quantum computers sometimes require special refrigeration conditions. This is actually one of the things that we were the most positive about. It was the most common topic in school physics, but was often taught without an explicit link to quantum. Some countries have actually begun to integrate quantum in secondary schools. Places like Spain, Portugal, Canada, and the UK are starting to actively realize that they should be teaching quantum mechanics and to high school students, because quantum mechanics has already brought with it a technological revolution and is starting to bring a new one in this era of quantum computers. But this implementation of who gets to learn about this is often uneven, and many ask the question of, is it worth teaching quantum if it's so abstract, and doesn't it generate more confusion than interest? We think that there's 3 main things that you can do, or that teachers and schools and governments can do in order to kind of combat the implications of the question. The first one is make sure the teaching is focused on formulas, not necessarily conceptual understanding. Obviously, anecdotes, obviously representing ideas with visuals is very, very useful for learning, but it can be counterintuitive when learning about quantum mechanics. So it is important that the students understand the formula first and foremost. The second is absence of visuals and experimental support to explain quantum phenomena doesn't really help, right? If the students don't have any vision of what's going on, that's not really going to help them, right? So what we're saying, one, is not like, oh, like, don't show them visuals. What we're trying to say is like, don't, make up an anecdote. Don't try to, only talk about Schrodinger's cat, but like, show them how interference occurs with lasers. Actually visually showcase, the two-slit experiment, for example, and explain how quantum mechanics arises from that, because it's how it was discovered anyways, right? And then the third problem that we think is quite important is the fact of teacher preparation. Many teachers have not formally studied quantum mechanics, and obviously we do not want to place the blame on the teachers. In many countries they're, underpaid and overworked, but support from governments that want to implement quantum mechanic curriculum in their courses when their courses are already, overfilled, and, students can't even reach the end of the year with the existing material, it's just not doable, right? So you kind of have to prioritize preparing your teachers, preparing the material in a way in which these topics can be taught with the time that is required for them, and they won't be just left off because they'll never, like, students will never arrive to them because the curriculum is already overfilled. The third main thing that we talk about is informatics as a subject. So informatics is kind of the strategy for us to get to quantum technologies and quantum computers, right? It was first taught in Illinois as a subject and has since then been started to be taught across the world. Our pillars here are computational systems, the foundations for comparing quantum models to classical models, programs, so learning about algorithm and logic, control structures, code concepts, and then data representation in order to be able to answer questions like what is a qubit, how is it different from a bit, and how do we encode information in quantum or in qubits. Now this subject is relatively new, but it's actually very well taught from what we saw across the world in terms of what the governments propose as the materials that they're teaching. This obviously doesn't mean that it is taught well in classrooms, but the actual materials that it is teaching and how these are related to quantum computing, how they could support further learning in quantum technologies were really, really well put. And we saw quite a lot of countries that started teaching it recently. So for example, Chile and Brazil have started teaching informatics in the last decade. There's some of the countries that have recently taken it up that have been, let's say, the latest to this game. But out of the three subjects, this is where we got the most, green flags and positives, which is very good. Now, where are we now, really? We've got these three subjects, some with more or less gaps. But on top of these three subjects, we thought there was another thing that was actually quite interesting, where quantum mechanics and quantum learning showed up quite a lot, which was school projects. So in many countries, students do research projects, such as essays or practical works of some sort, where they get to explore topics outside of their usual curriculum. And these, we've seen, are kind of a great opportunity to introduce new concepts such as quantum computing without waiting for institutional changes, without having to say we're going to restructure the entire physics curriculum in order to fit quantum mechanics in it. They can kind of serve as our Troy horses for teaching students about quantum technologies and making them more accessible to them. They are already a thing in places like the International Baccalaureate or the Excellence Baccalaureate in Spain or the French Baccalaureate. But even within these three subjects and the school projects, beyond them, we kind of proposed certain good practices that we thought governments and schools could follow if they want to, teach high school students about quantum technologies, or at least make that knowledge accessible to them later on by preparing them with a strong physics, maths, and informatics curriculum. Good global practices in this sense, or in this first slide, refers to actual institutional changes that we've seen, or institutions or governments that we've seen across the world that have done things for high school students with the goal of teaching them these types of things. So the US has the National K-12 education partnership where they're actually focusing on K-12 students and teaching them about quantum tech. The EU had a QT Edu program where they were creating educational groups in coordination with schools to teach students about quantum. The UK has, through the National Quantum Computing Centre, had summer schools and work experiences, work placements for high school students. And in Canada, actually, we've got a really interesting thing through QEd, which is Quantum for Educators, where they welcome teachers from across the country and actually teach them about quantum mechanics and quantum technologies in a more advanced way so they can go and spread the news to their students. Now, apart from these good programs that already exist, that are being supported in certain parts of the world, there is also the question of open source. So what is open source? Open source can be software, courses, educational content, or active communities that exist online that are designed by experts and by people who are creating this material with the knowledge that it is correct and with the purpose of teaching others in a way that's accessible and free. These resources kind of allow students from countries where the type of programs I just talked about are not accessible, right? They just can't get access to this type of learning and these types of projects. There are maybe no projects that they can do in school related to quantum technologies. There are no, educational level support from government for this topic. And, having open source materials kind of allows for free and accessible global students to learn about these topics. And how can we actually achieve this? Well, we actually are already doing it. We have open SDKs like Qiskit, which have a lot of content for students to learn. There exist quantum games, quantum hackathons, and free online summer programs that are currently running, and you can find a big list of these in our paper. But the key, in our opinion, is that open student-led based education is kind of the way. So there's this wonderful paper that came out almost 2 years ago now about quantum pictorialism learning, where a group in Oxford University taught quantum pictorialism, which is a way of representing quantum processes, to high school students in the UK. And they actually got them to sit in Oxford level master's exam at the end of this experiment, and they did excellently well. They got, I think it was almost 70% of the students to pass with a great grade, and most of them passed, as in most of them that didn't get into that 70% may not have gotten the excellent grade, but still passed. It was absolutely fantastic. So high school students are absolutely capable of learning these topics. They just need to be presented to them in a way that's accessible. And in order to do that, we need to try not to fall into the pit of misinformation, right? Quantum computation is currently in fashion. There's a lot of hype and little clarity. If you just start looking out online, misconceptions spread really quickly. People think that quantum computers already surpass classical computers and everything, which is absolutely wrong. They think of quantum as kind of magic. Magic states don't really help with the wording. And if you can, they think things like if you connect two qubits and they immediately understand each other telepathically, which is also not correct. All these misconceptions generate unrealistic expectations that can cause frustration or rejection and discredit science if hype's not fulfilled. They also especially affect young students without the tools to fill them. Now, what can we do? Well, as I've said before, we can support and train teachers in order for them to be able to teach about these things without being misinformed. We can support student communities and help students mentor other students and support themselves alongside through this journey. And then we can also create platforms for quality control of online quantum content, where we basically get to, give out a stamp and say, hey, this content is created by people who are working in this field, who actually know about this field. We kind of point you towards this resource if you want to learn more about quantum mechanics or quantum computing or any other quantum technology. So our main conclusions was that quantum integration does not require new courses, but rather modular approaches, that open projects and teaching support can transform global access, and that we need investment, translation, teacher training, and student leadership in order to get to a diverse and inclusive future for quantum in the classroom. And the main thing is that the best defense against misinformation is honest and open collaborative education.